this is Brian Cuban. He is a lawyer, he is a best-selling author, and a mental health advocate. And from what I hear, you have a new book called Addicted Lawyer that came out not too long ago. So if you want to check that out, go for it. And he talks about eating disorders, drugs addiction, and alcoholism. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, awesome. So I want to talk about substance abuse and what that is looking like during this crazy pandemic. Okay, so can you tell us just a little bit about the relationship between substance abuse and mental health?
Well, I mean, there's a very high correlation between mental health issues and substance use, whether it's alcohol use or drug use. So yes, it would depend on the correlation is going to depend on a lot of different things, but they are very strongly connected. And there was a strong connection in my life between the two.
Can you give an example of, let's say, somebody has anxiety? What substances do you think that they would use?
That would entirely depend on their history and their story. I can tell you for me, the substances linked to my, not necessarily anxiety, depression, were alcohol and cocaine. So it's going to depend on the person, what their coping mechanisms look like. So I don't think I'd want to generalize about that. I can tell you how it was for me anecdotally, but it could be for someone else, it could be marijuana. For someone else, it could be opioids. So it just depends on the person who is struggling.
And how easy is it to come by these substances?
How easy is it? Well, what is the definition of addiction? Obsessive drug-seeking behavior in the face of known consequences. So I mean, for me personally, if you look and you find it, right? You know where to go because you need to get it. Addiction is a disease. It's a biological brain-based. I'll never say that correctly, no matter how many times I try. Brain-based process. So people find it now, depending on what community you're in. I see stories, and especially within the opioid community and the heroin community, things are becoming a little bit more difficult because of the pandemic. So things may change based on the crisis we're in. As an example, there was a controversy, in Pennsylvania, not so much in Texas, about liquor stores closing. Well, one of the consequences of that, the law of unintended consequences, is that there are many people in underserved communities on the street and such who don't have access to 12-step groups, who don't have access to residential treatment, who don't have access to sober homes and all of the maybe ground level things that people of different levels of privilege may have. So somebody in that situation who, say, has severe alcohol use disorder may be only one drink away from potentially fatal withdrawal. And closing the liquor stores could prevent that person from getting that drink. So if you subscribe to a harm reduction model of recovery, you want that person to be able to get that drink so he or she alive. Consequences to unintended consequences to some of the things that are going on right now in the recovery community.
Okay, so you kind of got into one of the next questions that I wanted to talk about, and that is how quarantining might affect someone with a substance abuse disorder. So you talked about more in a big scheme of this is how it affects the entire nature of substance abuse.
No, I mean, let's make it personal. If I was a quote unquote alcoholic, severe alcohol use disorder, and I needed a drink, to not get the quote unquote DTs, to not go into withdrawal. Alcohol is one of the substances where you can die from withdrawal. Wow. And so I need that drink. And if I can't get that drink, all of a sudden I'm in the emergency room, and all of a sudden I'm taking up a bed, an emergency room intensive care bed that we may need for a COVID patient. So there are all of these chains of consequences that go on. Now, I saw an article in which as we would expect, the use of consumption of alcohol has skyrocketed. So that can play out on a number of different levels. You could have someone who really was on the low end or was just on the fringe, all of a sudden tipping into alcohol use disorder, into problem drinking. You can have someone who depended mightily on mutual aid groups such as 12-step or counseling, and now they may not have access to it, or trying to get telecounseling. And so they may trend towards isolation and flip back to drinking as a coping mechanism, and all of a sudden they've relapsed. So I've heard anecdotally of quite a few relapses, and I suspect at some point this will be quantified in some study down the road, who knows how long. But somebody who suffers from clinical depression may revert back to alcohol as a coping mechanism, which is in itself a depressant. And so there are just so many different levels where the current situation can have a negative and even a destructive impact on mental health, that we could go through countless different scenarios: suicidal thoughts, isolation, who are we reaching out to? We don't want to reach out. I've heard quite a few people, they've told me personally, they're struggling. Well, why don't you reach out to your neighbor? Why don't you tell your spouse? Well, she's taking care of the kids. I just can't tell her what I'm going through because this is just one more thing. And so they're projecting out, and they end up holding it in, and sooner or later it's going to leak out in some negative way.
Yeah. Do you think that there's any positive influences of the situation on somebody who's dealing with a substance abuse disorder?
I mean, again, it would depend on it. To me, I've always been someone who has been kind of trended towards likes being alone and solitude, and I do well in my solitude for the most part, even while I take medication for my depression. And I just had my 13th year in recovery from alcohol and cocaine and my eating disorder last, I believe it was on April 8th. Wow. So, but there's a difference between solitude and being forced into it, voluntary solitude and being forced into it. So, I mean, sure, if you are able to focus, if you are able to basically keep the same structure that you have in recovery outside of this, you might be able, sure, you can turn this into, I'm not going to say a positive because this is not a positive, but you might be able to stay on center with your recovery. And that is very possible, but there are things that I've needed to do, and I think there are things people can do to stay on center until we get through this.
That's good. What are your tips for people right now that either have a family member who struggles with it or that are struggling with it themselves?
First off is that there is support out there. It is not, remember, we are physically different. Physically distanced, I hate the term social distancing because we are physically distanced. We are not necessarily distanced. In the broader sense, we may be socially distanced in the classic sense, where we can't go over each other's house, we can't hug, we can't let someone cry on our shoulder, we can't do all of those things. But there is a plethora of recovery people. There are people who want to help, and the resources are out there. Mental Health America has a ton of resources online. If you're a lawyer, the Lawyers Assistance Programs put online resources out there. You just have to get on there and look for them. And a lot of people aren't comfortable Zooming. Pick up the phone, create what I call your behavior wheel. Who are the people we go through all these emotions. I'm in the center. Create the little spokes out to all the different people that you talk to in your life when you're feeling this particular emotion, and why you don't feel you can talk to them right now. And most of the time, in my anecdotal experience, it's because of projection. We're projecting out that they're suffering and they're struggling and don't have time for us, so we end up not making the call and just internalize everything. So there are resources out there.
That's really good. So before we end the interview, is there anything that you would like to say?
Yes, if you are struggling, it sounds like a cliche, but you reach out. And more importantly, if you know if reach out to the people, even reach out to the people you care about, even if you don't know that they're struggling, because they may not want to tell you. Even if you're not struggling, create your behavior wheel. And because we're all interconnected from a mental health standpoint. And that person you reach out to, 3 other people reach out to that person. And it's just a cumulative process of mental health stability, mental health recovery. And we're all part of that. We're one big wheel, just touching each other.
That's true. I couldn't
Virtually.
get through anything without other people. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I mean, we need to stay connected, and not just when we are emotionally triggered to do so. We need to stay connected regularly throughout the day.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is great. And this episode will be online on Tuesday, and we will send it out as well.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.